On November 22, 1963, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas shocked the world, cutting short his vision for peace, civil rights, and progress. His death left America in mourning, sparking conspiracy theories and changing the course of history, both domestically and globally. On November 22, 1963, at precisely 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was fatally shot while riding in a motorcade through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. The shocking event, broadcast almost immediately across the world, sent ripples through the fabric of the 20th century. It was a moment so sudden, so violent, and so public that it seemed to freeze time. The image of Jacqueline Kennedy climbing across the trunk of the presidential limousine in a blood-soaked pink suit is etched into the collective memory of modern history, a symbol of vulnerability at the heart of the most powerful nation on Earth. Though political assassinations were not new to the American experience, Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, and William McKinley had all fallen to assassins. Kennedy's death occurred during a uniquely fragile moment in global affairs. The Cold War was at its height, the nuclear arms race was spiraling, civil rights tensions were rising, and the United States was asserting itself as a global hegemon. Within this atmosphere, the assassination did not just mark the death of a president. It became a historical pivot, signaling the beginning of a more cynical, fractured, and violent era. Historians often regard November 22, 1963, as a symbolic end to the post-World War II optimism. It marked the start of a dark spiral of social upheaval, government mistrust, foreign entanglements, and further high-profile assassinations. The bullet that struck John F. Kennedy also struck the heart of an era, ushering in what would become one of the most turbulent decades in modern history. From a historical perspective, it wasn't just a national tragedy. It was a global realignment of perceptions, power, and purpose. The post-war American idealism, 1945 to 1963. To understand the full historical impact of JFK's assassination, one must first grasp the context of the era he came to symbolize. The years following World War II were a time of enormous transformation. The United States emerged as a superpower, its economy booming while much of Europe and Asia lay in ruins. The American public, having endured the Great Depression and global conflict, yearned for stability, prosperity, and moral clarity. In this fertile ground, the seeds of post-war idealism were planted. The 1950s brought technological advancement, suburban expansion, and the birth of the American middle class. The GI Bill educated millions. Highways crisscrossed the country. Television brought entertainment and politics into the home. Yet beneath this surface of conformity and comfort, tensions brewed. Racial injustice, gender inequality, and the existential threat of nuclear war loomed large. When John F. Kennedy won the presidency in 1960, he represented a generational shift. At just 43, he was the youngest elected U.S. president and the firstborn in the 20th century. He spoke of a new frontier, a phrase that encapsulated the dreams of a modern, progressive America. His inaugural address, delivered in January 1961, called on Americans to ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. It was more than rhetoric. It was a call to action that resonated with a youthful, post-war nation seeking purpose. Kennedy's presidency, though brief, was defined by a sense of energetic idealism. His administration pursued civil rights legislation, established the Peace Corps, and committed the U.S. to landing a man on the moon. Internationally, he navigated one of the most perilous moments in world history during the Cuban Missile Crisis, emerging with increased global respect. His style, elegant, intellectual, and media-savvy, helped shape the image of a confident America moving forward into the space age. Yet this idealism was fragile. Domestically, segregation still gripped the South. Internationally, Cold War conflicts simmered in Berlin, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Kennedy walked a political tightrope, trying to balance progress with pragmatism. His assassination, then, was more than a personal loss. It was the destruction of a symbolic figure who embodied post-war optimism. With his death, the idealistic vision of the 1960s began to unravel, making way for the disillusionment, dissent, and division that would characterize the remainder of the decade. Cold War tensions and JFK's diplomacy. By the time John F. Kennedy assumed office in 1961, the world had been entrenched in Cold War dynamics for over a decade. The post-World War II alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union had rapidly dissolved into an ideological and geopolitical standoff, with both nations vying for influence across the globe. Communism and capitalism, each seeing the other as a direct existential threat, turned entire continents into proxy battlegrounds. In this precarious atmosphere, Kennedy inherited a world teetering on the edge of nuclear catastrophe. Kennedy's presidency was defined by a series of Cold War crises, none more perilous than the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. After U.S. reconnaissance photos revealed Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, the world faced the very real prospect of nuclear war. Kennedy's response was to impose a naval quarantine around Cuba and demand immediate removal of the missiles. For 13 days, the world held its breath. A single misstep, a miscommunication, or a rogue military officer could have triggered thermonuclear war. But Kennedy, through intense back-channel diplomacy and a careful balance of pressure and restraint, navigated the crisis without bloodshed. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret promise to remove American missiles from Turkey. This moment was a defining achievement of JFK's foreign policy. It demonstrated a level-headed approach to global conflict and established direct communication between Washington and Moscow through the creation of the hotline. His ability to stare down Nikita Khrushchev without resorting to war earned him both domestic praise and international admiration. However, Kennedy's Cold War record was not without controversy. Early in his presidency, he authorized the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, a CIA-backed operation involving Cuban exiles attempting to overthrow Fidel Castro. The failure was a humiliation for the U.S. and a propaganda victory for the POW Soviets. Yet Kennedy publicly took responsibility for the failure, which paradoxically bolstered his image as a strong and accountable leader. Kennedy also supported the space race as a peaceful outlet for Cold War rivalry. His 1961 commitment to landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade symbolized American innovation and ambition, contrasting sharply with the militaristic imagery of nuclear brinkmanship. Toward the end of his life, Kennedy appeared to shift his approach. In a remarkable speech at American University in June 1963, he spoke of the need for peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union, highlighting the shared humanity of all people regardless of ideology. He also worked toward the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was signed in August 1963 by the US, the UK, and the USSR, a major diplomatic breakthrough. His assassination just months later froze this potential trajectory. Many historians have speculated that had Kennedy lived, he might have pursued a more conciliatory path with the Soviet Union, altering the course of Cold War escalation. Instead, his death removed a cautious yet visionary leader from the global chessboard, at a time when the stakes were nothing short of planetary survival. Among the most tragic consequences of JFK's assassination was the dramatic escalation of the Vietnam War, a conflict that would come to define American foreign policy in the second half of the 20th century. Though U.S. involvement in Vietnam had begun before Kennedy, with Truman and Eisenhower both providing aid to the French and later to the South Vietnamese, Kennedy's presidency marked a turning point in the American military and political commitment to the region. By 1963, the U.S. had sent approximately 16,000 military advisors to South Vietnam under the banner of supporting anti-communist efforts and containing the spread of Soviet influence in Southeast Asia. Kennedy, while firmly anti-communist and a believer in the domino theory, the idea that if one nation fell to communism, neighboring states would follow, was also wary of becoming too deeply involved in what he increasingly saw as a civil conflict lacking clear American strategic interest. In private conversations and in some public statements, Kennedy hinted at skepticism regarding long-term American military presence in Vietnam. His aides, including Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, have indicated that JFK was preparing to withdraw 1,000 advisors by the end of 1963, a plan codified in National Security Action Memorandum 263. Whether this withdrawal would have expanded into a full disengagement is the subject of intense historical debate, but many scholars argue that Kennedy had begun re-evaluating America's role in Vietnam and was leaning toward a phased exit. This cautious approach ended with his assassination. Lyndon B. Johnson, who succeeded Kennedy, quickly reversed course. Believing that a loss in Vietnam would damage U.S. credibility globally and domestically, Johnson embraced a more aggressive policy. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964, in which 2 U.S. destroyers were allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese forces, the second attack remains disputed, became the pretext for Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving Johnson nearly unlimited authority to wage war. By 1965, combat troops were on the ground, and by the late 1960s, over 500,000 U.S. soldiers were deployed in Vietnam. The war dragged on for a decade, resulting in over 58,000 American deaths, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese casualties, and a deeply divided American public. The war's consequences were far-reaching. It fractured national trust in government, fueled the counterculture movement, and reshaped how Americans viewed their role in the world. For many, Kennedy's death represented a lost opportunity, a moment when the U.S. might have stepped back, avoided quagmire, and focused on diplomacy instead of destruction. Historically, the Vietnam War stands as a devastating what-if scenario tied directly to JFK's assassination. Had he lived, it is possible, though not certain, that the conflict could have been avoided or managed with more restraint. Instead, his death cleared the path for the war's full-scale eruption, changing the trajectory of both American foreign policy and domestic unity for generations. While the Cold War dominated foreign policy, at home, the United States was undergoing a moral reckoning. The civil rights movement, long simmering under the surface of American life, had begun to erupt into the national spotlight. Jim Crow segregation, voter suppression, racial violence, and entrenched inequality in the South and across the country were no longer tolerated by a rising generation of Black Americans and allies who demanded change. When John F. Kennedy entered office in 1961, civil rights activists had already been organizing for years, pushing for justice through court battles, grassroots activism, and nonviolent protest. But the early 1960s marked a new intensity. The Freedom Rides in 1961, where interracial groups rode buses into the segregated South to test federal desegregation orders, were met with brutal violence. In 1962, the attempted enrollment of James Meredith, a Black Air Force veteran, at the University of Mississippi, sparked riots that required federal troops for enforcement. Kennedy's initial approach to civil rights was cautious. Elected with thin margins and needing support from Southern Democrats in Congress, he was hesitant to alienate that base. He preferred quiet legal action over sweeping public statements, yet the relentless pressure of the movement forced his hand. The images of police dogs and fire hoses turned on peaceful protesters in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963, shocked the conscience of the nation. Activists like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who penned his famous letter from Birmingham jail that year, intensified the moral call for federal action. Kennedy began to shift. On June 11, 1963, following the violent showdown at the University of Alabama, Kennedy gave a nationally televised address that became a watershed moment. He called civil rights a moral issue, as old as the scriptures and as clear as the high American Constitution. Soon after, he proposed what would become the Civil Rights Act of 1964, legislation aimed at ending segregation in public places and banning employment discrimination. Tragically, Kennedy would not live to see it passed. His assassination left the nation in mourning, but it also spurred political will. President Lyndon B. Johnson, leveraging the emotional momentum and invoking Kennedy's legacy, pushed the bill through Congress, resulting in its passage in July 1964. This landmark law transformed American society. Beyond legislation, Kennedy's image and words became part of the moral lexicon of the civil rights movement. Though not always as proactive as activists had hoped during his life, his assassination amplified his more progressive stances and allowed his legacy to serve as a rallying cry for justice. In the broader historical view, JFK's death symbolized a deeper fracture in America, a country longing for unity and progress but haunted by its original sins. The 1960s would bring more change, but also more violence, marked by the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. Further, tearing at the nation's social fabric, the idealism Kennedy had begun to embrace became a vision tragically left incomplete. The assassination, November 22, 1963. The events of November 22, 1963, unfolded with almost cinematic intensity. President Kennedy arrived in Dallas, Texas, as part of a political tour intended to shore up support for the Democratic Party in the South. Despite simmering local tensions and warnings of possible hostility, the president insisted on riding through Dallas in an open-top convertible, a decision meant to symbolize transparency and confidence. As the motorcade turned onto Elm Street, in Dealey Plaza at approximately 12:30 p.m., 3 shots rang out. Chaos erupted. Governor John Connally, seated in front of the president, was also struck. Kennedy slumped over, gravely wounded. Just minutes later, he was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where doctors attempted emergency treatment. At 1:00 p.m., John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. He was 46 years old. That same afternoon, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in aboard Air Force One, next to a visibly traumatized Jacqueline Kennedy, still wearing the blood-stained pink suit that would become an enduring symbol of grief. The immediate suspect, Lee Harvey Oswald, a 24-year-old former Marine and self-declared Marxist, was arrested just hours later. He was accused of firing from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, using a bolt-action rifle. However, just 2 days later, as Oswald was being transferred from city jail, he was shot and killed on live television by Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner with mob connections. This dramatic murder of the key suspect sealed a sense of mystery and paranoia that has never fully lifted. In the days that followed, a stunned nation mourned. Millions watched as Kennedy's flag-draped coffin lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. His funeral, held on November 25th, was broadcast worldwide, cementing the moment in global memory. The sight of 3-year-old John F. Kennedy Jr. saluting his father's casket became a haunting emblem of a nation's loss. Historically, the assassination was more than a tragedy. It was a rupture. America, already strained by Cold War anxiety and civil unrest, now lost its most charismatic leader in a burst of public violence. The psychological trauma of the event cannot be overstated. It shattered the post-war sense of security and optimism. For many, it felt like the end of innocence, a grim entry into a darker, more cynical age. The Warren Commission, appointed by President Johnson, concluded in 1964 that Oswald acted alone. But public skepticism quickly took root. Over the decades, alternate theories have proliferated, involving the CIA, FBI, Mafia, KGB, and even Lyndon Johnson himself. The lack of clear, satisfying answers has made Kennedy's assassination not just a historical event, but a permanent cultural mystery, forever contested, endlessly re-examined. From a historical standpoint, November 22, 1963, marks one of the most pivotal days in the 20th century. It changed not only the trajectory of American leadership, but also the psyche of the American people. The bullet that killed JFK didn't just end a presidency, it ended an era. In the wake of President Kennedy's assassination, the American public demanded answers. Who killed the president? Why? Was it part of a broader plot? The seemingly senseless murder of a young, dynamic leader in broad daylight on American soil created a vacuum filled with disbelief, anxiety, and a desperate need for clarity. To address growing concerns, President Lyndon B. Johnson established the Warren Commission on November 29, 1963, named after its chairman, Chief Justice Earl Warren. The commission consisted of 7 members, including future President Gerald Ford, Senator Richard Russell, and former CIA Director Allen Dulles. Their mission, to investigate the circumstances of JFK's death and present a full report to the U.S. American public. After 10 months of investigation, the Warren Report, published in September 1964, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in assassinating President Kennedy. Jack Ruby also acted alone in killing Oswald. There was no evidence of a conspiracy, foreign or domestic. The report spanned 888 pages and relied on thousands of interviews, ballistic tests, forensic analyses, and eyewitness accounts. Despite its comprehensive scope, it left the public with more questions than answers. Critics quickly pointed out inconsistencies, missing witnesses, contradictory testimonies, and an over-reliance on circumstantial evidence. The theory that Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository with a bolt-action rifle, striking a moving target, was plausible but not universally convincing. The single bullet theory, in particular, became a lightning rod for controversy. This theory posited that one bullet struck both Kennedy and Governor Connally, causing multiple wounds and emerging largely intact. Skeptics mockingly dubbed it the magic bullet. To many, it defied physics and common sense. As early as the late 1960s, public trust in the Warren Commission began to erode. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy in 1968, combined with the chaos of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, further fueled a culture of doubt and suspicion toward government institutions. The 1970s saw the rise of alternative investigations. In 1979, the United States House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, concluded that JFK was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy, though they could not determine its scope or participants. They cited acoustic evidence and inconsistencies in the original investigation, but left many issues unresolved. Over time, conspiracy theories flourished, becoming a permanent part of American culture. CIA involvement. Some believed Kennedy was killed for attempting to dismantle the CIA after the Bay of Pigs and his growing resistance to Cold War hawkishness. Mafia retaliation. Others pointed to organized crime, alleging retribution for Robert Kennedy's aggressive prosecution of mafia figures as Attorney General. Cuban connection. Involvement by Castro's Cuba or anti-Castro exiles was also considered, in light of Kennedy's handling of the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Military-industrial complex. A theory emerged that Kennedy's resistance to full-scale involvement in Vietnam threatened powerful interests. Hollywood and pop culture helped cement these suspicions. Films like Oliver Stone's JFK 1991 portrayed elaborate plots involving government insiders. Books and documentaries multiplied, offering competing narratives and speculative reconstructions. Historically, the Warren Commission stands as one of the most contested official inquiries in modern times. It may have aimed to provide closure, but instead, it opened a Pandora's box of mistrust. The Kennedy assassination became the cornerstone of the modern American conspiracy era, a mirror reflecting the nation's fractured identity, lost idealism, and enduring skepticism toward power. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, sent an emotional shockwave across the United States and the world. It was not simply the death of a president, it was the sudden, violent end to a promise of youthful vigor, idealism, and national renewal. Americans of all races, classes, and political affiliations watched in disbelief. Schools closed, factories halted, and television programming was suspended for 4 days of continuous news coverage, an unprecedented media event that brought the nation into a shared space of collective mourning. Nearly every household had a television, and the image of Kennedy's young widow, Jacqueline Kennedy, stoically leading the mourning procession, helped etch the tragedy into the national soul. Kennedy's funeral was held on November 25th, the same day as his son's 3rd birthday. Foreign dignitaries from over 90 countries attended. The ceremony, modeled after Abraham Lincoln's state funeral, emphasized both dignity and sorrow. John F. Kennedy Jr.'s salute as the flag-draped casket passed became one of the most iconic moments in American history. In the days following the assassination, Americans wrestled not only with grief, but with fear. What did the killing of a president in broad daylight mean for the stability of democracy? Was the nation under attack from within? The sense of vulnerability and trauma would not easily fade. The transition of power to Lyndon B. Johnson occurred almost immediately. On Air Force One, just hours after the assassination, Johnson was sworn in with Jackie Kennedy at his side. While he projected strength and continuity, the shadow of Kennedy loomed large. Johnson moved quickly to honor Kennedy's legacy, especially by pushing forward the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which had been stalled in Congress. But emotionally and culturally, the United States had changed. The assassination marked the end of the post-war age of optimism. The 1960s would continue with upheaval, Vietnam, urban riots, political assassinations, and generational division. The belief in progress through unity was replaced by cynicism, fragmentation, and confrontation. Internationally, the world also mourned. Kennedy had been a global figure, charismatic, articulate, and young. He had represented the hope of a new generation of Western leadership. Memorials sprung up from Berlin to Tokyo, from Dublin to Johannesburg, with thousands attending. Candlelight vigils. His legacy as a voice for peace and diplomacy was especially resonant during the height of Cold War paranoia. Domestically, Kennedy's image became hallowed. His presidency was retrospectively idealized, dubbed Camelot, after Jackie Kennedy, referenced the Broadway musical of the same name in an interview. The term came to symbolize a mythical time of American grace, vision, and nobility, even though the real politics of the early 1960s were far more complex. Historically, this mourning phase marked not just sadness over Kennedy's death, but the end of innocence. The generation that had come of age under the New Deal and fought in World War II now saw that even their brightest hopes could be extinguished by a rifle shot. What replaced it was a more disillusioned America, one that would soon question its government, its wars, and its values like never before. In essence, JFK's death was not just a loss of a man. It was a national rupture, a moment when America was forced to look inward and grapple with the shadows of its own ideals. The assassination of John F. Kennedy was not only the death of a president, it was the death of potential, of what could have been. More than 6 decades later, historians, political thinkers, and the public still grapple with the legacy of a man whose presidency lasted just over 1,000 days. Despite its brevity, Kennedy's time in office left a profound imprint on America's identity and its place in the world. His legacy is defined both by what he accomplished and by the haunting possibilities of what he never had the chance to do. At the time of his death, Kennedy was a symbol of youth, vigor, and modern American progress. At 43, he had been the youngest elected president in U.S. history, the first Catholic, and a war hero who had captured the imagination of a nation teetering between the post-war boom and the looming uncertainties of the Cold War. He brought glamour to the White House, young children, a fashionable first lady, and an administration populated with energetic, idealistic intellectuals known as the best and the brightest.